Welcome into the Why You're Wrong Fantasy Football Podcast. We are now on episode 20. As you can see, I'm back in my photography studio. Brian, the fantasy force here, cannot be with us for this episode. He's busy with a lot of work and life-related events this week, but today we're going to be talking about the studs and duds of the early rounds, specifically rounds 1 through 4, which is about the top 50 players. If you play in a 12-team league, technically that's 48, so I'm just kind of pushing that border to 50. I've got a few studs in each round I want to talk about and a few duds. Now, it's really hard to have a dud in the first few rounds. It's really hard to identify that kind of player. So they're not really duds. It's just almost just guys with like big red flags that you want to be aware of before you draft them going into your fantasy draft. As our typical intro, my name is John. I'm your monotone master. Brian's the fantasy force here who can't be here. You can find us on social media, TikTok and Instagram as Why You're Wrong FFB, and as Twitter as You're Wrong FFB. Now, we are professionals. We know a lot about fantasy football. We've both been playing for years, but we don't have the time to really stat out every single individual player. And making these episodes actually takes a lot of time in the background to produce and plan out. So unfortunately, we don't have those hours to get you every single individual stat, but we can give you our insight, give you our thoughts, and if you want to debate us on any of your player expectations or thoughts that we have that we tell you guys, feel free to put it in the comments section. As long as it doesn't get toxic, I love talking about fantasy football, so if you have any thoughts and insights, feel free to leave them below on any social media feed that you find us on. Some impactful news is there's really nothing going on right now. It's almost the end of June, going into July. We'll get more into training camps going forward, but so far, the Aaron Rodgers update is the biggest thing kind of holding grasp of the NFL drama right now. And nothing has changed so far. Aaron Rodgers has not reported to camp. He doesn't want to play for the Packers. They haven't traded him yet. We're still waiting to see what actually happens with that fallout. Early round studs and duds. So kind of the studs are your safe players. They have a guaranteed role. They have a history of past success of helping fantasy teams. Now your duds are risky players. They could bust. They're being overdrafted due to their previous performance, which might seem to be an outlier. So these are guys that are going to be going within the first 4 rounds of most fantasy drafts, maybe 5 if you're playing in an 8-team or a 10-team league. But typically, these are your guys going in the first 4 rounds of your fantasy drafts. So to start off with some round 1 studs, we already know that Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook are going to have great years. They're most likely going to go 1 and 2 overall, respectively, in drafts. So the first that I want to point out is Derrick Henry, going as the 3rd overall pick at the moment. He's the running back 3 off the board. So the thing about Derrick Henry is he's the big, heavy, gonna run through your face running back. So the problem is he's not a pass catcher. So typically in years past, fantasy managers are always hesitant to draft Derrick Henry because he's never going to get any of that receiving work, which is really vital in half PPR and PPR formats. But Derrick Henry is so efficient running the ball. Last year had over 2,000 yards, 17 touchdowns, and averaged 20 points per game with almost no receiving work. And that includes 6 games over 20 points, eclipsed 100 yards over 11 games. So regardless if he gets the ball thrown to him or not, he's going to have a lot of work in the offense. He only had 4 games under 10 points, and that's pretty much when the game gets too out of hand where they have to throw the ball to catch up, or the defense is really just able to contain Derrick Henry. That was only 4 games of the season, so that's 25% of the season where he kind of let you down, but that means 75% of the season he performed the way you expected him to. Now, the addition of Julio Jones to the Titans offense prevents the defense from being able to key in just on Derrick Henry, and the problem was if A.J. Brown went down due to injury, or if something happened, the defense could just focus in on Derrick Henry. But now with Julio Jones there, if A.J. Brown or Julio goes down to injury, there's still at least one elite wide receiver there to make the defense be preoccupied with them instead of being able to put all 11 guys in the box to stop Henry. Another round 1 guy that I look as a stud. Now, he's basically a stud because of how late he has fallen into the draft, but Ezekiel Elliott has fallen from the grace of being a potential top 3 running back in people's minds. And that really just has to do with the fact that last year, he had a terrible year and he had a fumbling issue. But looking at the year in perspective, he was the running back 3 when Dak Prescott was still healthy. The time that Ezekiel Elliott fell out of the grace was during the stretch of when he had quarterbacks like Ben DiNucci and Andy Dalton, because he finished as the running back 11 and was basically as I mentioned earlier, the running back 3 or 4 until Dak got hurt. And he had no bust games the first 5 weeks. So if you drafted Ezekiel Elliott and got a full Dak Prescott season last year, you would have been thrilled with where you got him. I think getting him as the 8th overall pick right now is still huge, because if you're that late into the draft, you've missed on the top 7 running backs. So if you can still get Zeke, who has the ability to be a top 5 running back, and you get him as the 8th overall running back, you could have a really good fantasy year, and he's not going to crush your team. I know that a lot of people are scared of Tony Pollard coming in and eating into Zeke's workload. But even with last year, with the Zeke having his fumbling problem, with the year not going so well, Zeke never really did get benched. So I don't think you can really worry about Tony Pollard taking over for Zeke. And once they started off the year strong again with Zeke and Dak in that offense, Tony Pollard might come in, he might steal some reps, he might steal a touchdown or 2, but Zeke will still be getting the far majority of the workload as the Cowboys offense seems at the moment. If something happens right up until the first game of week 1 where Zeke somehow gets injured and Tony Pollard takes over, you just want to watch for that. But that's just why it's important to watch the NFL news leading up to your fantasy draft. Another round 1 stud is Tyreek Hill. Now, he's most likely going to be the first receiver off the board, because if Aaron Rodgers does leave Green Bay, Davante Adams is going to fall. So the thing is, Tyreek Hill is one of Mahomes' favorite targets. Finished last year as a wide receiver 2, averaging 19 points per game. He had 5 games over 20 points, including that 51-point game versus Tampa Bay, if you can remember that. And only had 2 bust games. He only had 2 games throughout the entire season where he had under 10 points. I think over the years he has shown that he can run every single route, and he's too fast for any 1 or even 2 people to cover. So even though he isn't a high reception guy, he is always going to be open. He's going to get those deep bomb touchdowns, and he's a very talented receiver who Mahomes loves to throw the ball to. So if you're late in the draft and you're the 9th or 10th pick and you can take Tyreek Hill, you may want to start a wide receiver heavy build, or just go best player available, because all the top running backs have gone. But you're still going to be able to get a player who's going to give you about 19 to 20 points per game if you take Tyreek Hill. So now, round 1, duds. So as I mentioned before, these aren't duds as in they're going to submarine your season. You just need to think about them in a greater perspective, because they might have bigger red flags than other guys in round 1. And so 2 of them is a combo pack, so they play on the same team as Davante Adams and Aaron Jones. Right now, Davante Adams is going 11th overall as a wide receiver 2, and Aaron Jones is going 10th overall as the running back 9. So that last year, they were the wide receiver 1 and running back 5, which was outstanding. But that's a year with Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. Everyone's greatest fear is if Aaron Rodgers leaves, those two's value drops significantly, because we don't know what the offense will be like with Jordan Love, or if Blake Bortles wins out in camp. So one of the things to think about is, if the season started now, I'd be hesitant. I wouldn't draft Davante Adams until maybe later in round 2. And Aaron Jones, he's going to get that workload because they did give him a lot of money. They released Jamal Williams, but they still have A.J. Dillon, who's going to be that big, heavy back, goal line back. So it's one of those things where if Aaron Rodgers is the quarterback, I love Aaron Jones, late first round, early second round. If Aaron Rodgers is not the quarterback, I probably wouldn't want to take either one of those guys until midway through the 3rd round, or maybe super late into the 2nd round, because they're still going to be the main focal points of that offense. But without the talent of Aaron Rodgers, they're most likely going to have less opportunities to score, and will most likely playing more defense than being on the ball, being on the field for offense. Another round 1 dud. So he's not a dud. He just has more red flags than the other guys going around him, is Saquon Barkley. Right now he's going as the 4th overall player off the board as the running back 4. So years ago when Saquon had his legendary season, this is his rookie year, which was now 3 years ago. He was the only option really in New York to really give the ball to besides OBJ. So he got so much receiving work that people's memory of him as having that spectacular rookie season where he finished as a running back 2 behind Todd Gurley is why people keep drafting him super high. The past year and a half have been lost due to injury. Now, these are injuries that you can come back from, but the one last year was so much damage to his knee and his ACL that the problem is there is a little bit of risk if you take him. The Giants have also had Kenny Golladay and Kadarius Toney. So there's more receiving targets in New York. So he's not going to get that crazy amount of receiving workload that he did last year. So Saquon Barkley is still going to be great for fantasy. But what you have to think about is the fact, if you draft him with the running back 4, you're drafting him at his ceiling. He has the talent to be a top 5 back. But I think the hope that he's the 1 or 2 again is that's years gone. If you take Saquon Barkley around 4th overall pick, you might be disappointed. So you might want to be looking at a Kamara or a Henry or a Chubb or Ezekiel Elliott. And then if you're smart, you can take Saquon Barkley later. But let the better players fall to you as Saquon Barkley goes at the 4th or 3rd or 5th spot. One more thing to note is if you're drafting Saquon Barkley, this is just a food for thought, but if you're drafting Saquon to be a top 2 running back, why aren't you drafting Odell Beckham to be a top 2 wide receiver? Because the last time they were both top of the fantasy boards were at the same time together 4 years ago. Okay, round 2 studs. I think the first one is Travis Kelce. He's going 14th overall as the tight end 1 as he should be. He can even sneak into the first round if people want to change their teams. They really just want to make sure they get him on their roster. Last year, he had 1,400 yards, 11 touchdowns, averaged 17.4 points per game. Why that's important is because the average top 10 tight end only gets about 8 or 9 points per game. So you're pretty much more than doubling how much points you're getting on one position, which is huge in fantasy if you have Travis Kelce on your team. He's one of Patrick Mahomes' favorite targets. And if we just switched him over to wide receiver, with his numbers alone, he would have been the wide receiver 4. And that's where he's being ranked at the moment because people realize how important he is to Kansas City and what Travis Kelce is to fantasy with how good he is, that you can either take a wide receiver 4 and put him in your tight end spot and then get 2 other great wide receivers in those spots as well. So the positional advantage of Travis Kelce is monumental in fantasy. And if all the top running backs go and you're staring down wide receiver 4, which is Calvin Ridley at the moment, or Travis Kelce, you should lean towards Travis Kelce. Another great stud in round 2 is 23rd off the board right now, and that's running back for the Los Angeles Chargers, Austin Eckler. He's going as the running back 13th right now, and I just think that's so low for him, and it's just because people just remember the middle part of his season last year where if he was on your team, you were super excited that Justin Herbert took over. They went to a pass-heavy offense, and then Austin Eckler had a horrific leg injury and missed the majority of the season. But once he returned, and this was a week 12 to 17, he is the running back 8 in a pass-heavy offense. So he's by far the best back on the team and gets a ton of pass-catching work, and they're in a division with the Raiders and the Chiefs where the Chargers will constantly have to throw the ball a lot. And if they're in that position again, Austin Eckler is going to have a great season. So if you think he can average the running back 8 and he's going as running back 13 right now, he's going to be a great pick if he falls to you in the 2nd round. Another guy that everyone's super hopeful for right now is A.J. Brown on the Titans. He's going as the 16th overall off the board as the wide receiver 5. He's already established himself as a number 1 wide receiver in the NFL. He finished as a wide receiver 11 last year, but that includes missing several games and also playing injured. A lot of people were hoping that this was the year that A.J. Brown might be able to put up Davante Adams-like numbers because their team let go of Jonnu Smith, Corey Davis, and a few other players, just soaking up all these targets that could go to A.J. Brown because they didn't sign anyone. But recently they traded for Julio Jones, which now may cap the ceiling of A.J. Brown, but that doesn't mean A.J. Brown is not going to have a good year. What this actually does mean is that defenses can't just focus solely on A.J. Brown with Julio Jones on the opposite side. So that means A.J. Brown will see easier coverages this year. And even with Julio Jones being on the field, he's still going to get so many targets through the course of the year because the defense will also have to take into consideration trying to stop Derrick Henry, as I mentioned earlier. So if A.J. Brown falls to you and you want to go wide receiver heavy, or you're going best player available and you've already taken a running back, A.J. Brown is a great 2nd pick in the 2nd round. Round 2 duds. So these 2 players, I only have 2 of them for round 2 because there's still so many good players in round 2 that would be awesome for your team, depending on how you're building it. But this one hurts to talk about because I'm a Seattle Seahawks fan. So DK Metcalf is a round 2 dud. And I only say that because going 18th overall in fantasy drafts right now as the wide receiver 6, He's being drafted at his potential ceiling. There's no room for error taking him where he is in fantasy drafts right now. People are taking him as the wide receiver 6, but last year he only finished as the wide receiver 7. What people remember is the first half of the season where he's the wide receiver 5 and he was averaging 18 points per game. And that's when the Seahawks offense was clicking, they were throwing the ball deep, and nothing was stopping them. The second half of the season, when my Seattle Seahawks offense got stagnant, they weren't changing it up, DK Metcalf was a wide receiver 17 through the second half. So the Seahawks made it clear that they don't want Wilson to throw the ball as much, even though they should. The team is much better offensively when they let Russell Wilson throw the ball and they don't try to run the ball into a terrible offensive line. That's just my bias as a Seahawks fan, but if they really change the offense, preventing Russell from throwing as much as he does or having more controlled style of play besides just throwing it deep, DK Metcalf may not have the season he did have last year. He'll still have a great season, but he may not be a top 5 wide receiver, but he could easily be a top 10 wide receiver. So if your whole league knows that and DK Metcalf falls to the 3rd round or maybe early 4th round, he's a great target there. But taking him early in the 2nd round, you're going to feel really disappointed if you have those stretches where DK disappears and you're going to be looking around thinking I could have had AJ Brown or Justin Jefferson or Calvin Ridley when DK Metcalf isn't doing that much, mainly just because of the Seahawks offense, not on the physical ability of DK Metcalf himself. He could easily still have a fantastic year. The thing is, all the guys in these early rounds, they're still talented enough to be top 5, top 10 at their respective positions, but you just have to consider the red flags that are attached to them based on how their teams operate and play. Another dud in round 2 is Patrick Mahomes, going as the 24th overall QB1 in fantasy drafts right now. So I know it sounds weird calling one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL a dud, but the problem is he's going so early in fantasy drafts that the value you're getting for taking Patrick Mahomes does not outweigh the value that you'd be getting on taking an elite running back or wide receiver. And this is because quarterbacks in fantasy, their points are so saturated with passing yards, passing touchdowns, and rushing yards that taking a quarterback in round 2 is basically going to tell you that that team is giving up on the positional advantage of top-end running backs, wide receivers, or tight ends. Because here's the thing. Patrick Mahomes is being taken as the QB1, but he was only the QB4 last year. The QB1 last year, Josh Allen, was taken in the 9th round. He's going in the 4th round this year. Last year's quarterback 2, Kyler Murray, is going in the 5th round. So kind of the sense is, there's such a huge saturation of points that reaching for Patrick Mahomes in round 2 will submarine your team because you'll be missing out on an elite prospect at a different position. If Patrick Mahomes somehow falls to round 4, then you can consider taking him, even though I'd still want to wait till round 5 before taking a quarterback of his skill level. Round 3 studs. One guy that I think everyone is super excited for this year that you've probably heard a lot about already is Terry McLaurin, wide receiver for the Washington football team. He's going as the 27th overall off the board, and he's the wide receiver 9 at the moment. Last year, he finished as the wide receiver 21 with terrible quarterback play, missing a handful of games due to injury. So the new quarterback in town is Ryan Fitzpatrick, and he hyper-targets his best wide receiver. Just to go over the past 3 guys that he's worked with, in 2019, also to note that these are the seasons that Ryan Fitzpatrick was the starter, not being benched for an up-and-coming guy or being benched because of bad play. These are years where he was able to start the majority of the season. 2019, Devontae Parker finished as the wide receiver 7. 2018, Mike Evans finished as the wide receiver 8. 2015, Brandon Marshall finished as the wide receiver 3. So if you want to believe that pattern, believe that Ryan Fitzpatrick doesn't care and just wants to throw it deep to his number 1 guy, then there's a top 10 wide receiver potential for Terry McLaurin and even a top 5 potential receiver. So taking him as the wide receiver 9 off the board is basically taking the hope that Ryan Fitzpatrick delivers him a fantastic season and that he could potentially break into the top 5 for wide receivers. So another guy in round 3 that I really like this year, a lot of people are down on him because he had a disappointing performance last year. But the thing to note about round 3, this is when it gets really dicey with running backs. Historically, running backs in round 3 and round 4 always disappoint you. So there's only really a small handful of guys in round 3 that I think you can really trust. And the one I think you can trust the most right now is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. He's going as a 32nd player overall off the board as the running back 16. So last year, he did not live up to the hype of his rookie year. People were taking him in the first or second round. And it was really just because the Chiefs did not run efficiently last year. He also missed several games at the end of the season due to illness and injury. And people were taking him as like the running back 8, and he finished as the running back 22. But here's some food for thought. He had over 1,000 scrimmage yards last year and 5 touchdowns. And only 5 touchdowns because he at least had 3 or 4 touchdowns that were robbed because of several penalties that happened on those plays. So if you could picture a rookie having 1,100 scrimmage yards and 9 to 10 touchdowns, you'd be excited for what he's about to come. The Chiefs have let go of Damian Williams, who is really the biggest threat, and Le'Veon Bell is also gone. So Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the most talented back and one of the most proficient offenses in the NFL. They've also gone out and improved their offensive line in free agency. And one thing to note is Andy Reid's running back is always fantasy relevant. So if you're drafting in the 3rd round and you want to take Clyde Edwards-Helaire as your second back, or you could even take him as your first back if you go wide receiver heavy, but taking Clyde to be a low-end running back 1, a solid RB2, or if you go super RB heavy, if you have the ability to throw Clyde Edwards-Helaire in your flex spot and he has a breakout season, he really makes that jump in year 2, that could be a guy who could potentially win you the draft. Because the only red flag against him right now is his bad rookie season. That's really about it. So if you're standing down, you need a running back in round 3. Clyde's a great target if he falls to you. Another round 3 stud is Keenan Allen. He's going 33rd overall off the board as your wide receiver 13. He's basically made it known he's Justin Herbert's favorite target. Finished as the wide receiver 14 last year, averaging 13.9 points per game. His only knock at him, though, was he missed last 2 weeks of the last season, which means if he got you to the championship, he wasn't there to help you win those games. But last year, he had 147 targets. Just having that volume alone makes him a great option to take, especially as a wide receiver 2, or if he's your wide receiver 1 after going running back. Taking Keenan Allen as your wide receiver 1 in round 3 isn't a bad deal. You're going to be very satisfied with the way Justin Herbert throws him the ball. And as I mentioned earlier, with the way the Chargers have to play based on the division that they're in, they're going to have to throw the ball to keep up with a bunch of teams in those games. So Keenan Allen should be on the field, catching the ball. He's a great PPR guy. He may not score a ton of touchdowns, but he's the best option that they have in a pass-heavy offense. Okay, round 3 duds. Now, as I've continuously mentioned, it's really hard to be like, this guy is a dud in round 3, mainly just because these guys have more red flags than others. So this is another combo because they're on the same team, they're at the same position, and it's really just because their team is so crowded with guys right now, it's really hard to confidently take one of them and put them on your team, even though they could still have a great season. It's just the fear of what could happen. Just everyone's kind of worried about the downward spiral just because there's so many receivers in this room, and I'm talking about the Buccaneers wide receivers, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Mike Evans is going 28th overall off the board, wide receiver 10, and Chris Godwin is going 36th overall off the board at wide receiver 14. So why does it feel so bad to take Mike Evans, who had almost an identical season to A.J. Brown, yet numbers-wise, Mike Evans still had a fantastic season? And I think it's really because Mike Evans had one of those seasons where he either completely submarined your team or he saved you. And you really want consistency from your elite fantasy players. So having a boomer bust guy as one of your best players, it really hurts those weeks where he totally lets you down. In his season last year, he had 6 awful games where he tanked your team, versus a 30-point game where he won you in the championship. So it comes down to if he really scores a touchdown or not. He's the red zone threat, but he's not the big yards per catch guy. He's not the reception guy getting the team from point A to point B. He's basically the target in the end zone on a loaded offense. The issue for Godwin is that people are worried about Antonio Brown because Antonio Brown has shown that he has not lost a step in the NFL and plays in a very similar way to Chris Godwin. Now, Chris Godwin is definitely number 2 on the team and can easily finish as a top 15 wide receiver regardless. I think the whole underlying problem is this. The Buccaneers have the fourth easiest schedule going into this season. They have a loaded offense. If Brady isn't throwing 3+ touchdowns per game, one of these guys is going to come away disappointed because you have Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown, O.J. Howard, and Rob Gronkowski. That's 5 guys who really want to try to score a touchdown every week, and only one quarterback supplying limited touchdowns to all 5 of those guys. And also, if they have the easiest schedule, there could be situations where all the touchdowns are rushing touchdowns to Ronald Jones or Leonard Fournette. Or it's a situation where the Buccaneers basically run the clock out the second half of the game because they're up by so much that Brady doesn't need to keep throwing the ball. So there's a problem where the Buccaneers could be too good, where they don't really need to supply fantasy points to every single one of their potential positions. A big round 3 dud is Miles Sanders. Now this guy, he's a lead back for his team at the moment. But the thing is, all the off-season trends are showing a downward spiral for Miles Sanders. So last year, okay, just to start off, he's going as 35th or off the board as the running back 18. Last year, he finished as a running back 23. He had just over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns, averaging 13 points per game, which doesn't sound terrible. But the reality is people were really hoping for a breakout season and it didn't happen. He's also a terrible pass catcher. He's one of the worst rated running backs when it comes to catching the ball. And because of that, his team drafted the best pass catching running back in the draft. Last year, Miles Sanders only had 2 games over 20 points and only 4 games over 100 total yards throughout the season. He had 5 games under 10 points for fantasy. And if you drafted him as running back 1 or running back 2, getting a game under 10 points totally crushes your team. And it's also, nothing has pointed up for the Philadelphia Eagles in the running game for Miles Sanders. And it just looks like the team realizes he's not a 3-down back. So drafting a 1 and 2 down back in the 3rd round is going to hurt your team more than it can help you. So if you're in the position where you have to take Miles Sanders, I wouldn't want to take him till the 4th round. As running back 2, if I've already taken 1 good running back and 2 wide receivers, and Miles Sanders is the only one there left, then you have to take him. But you shouldn't be reaching for Miles Sanders in round 3. There's plenty of better options you could be reaching for. So the funny thing about round 4 in fantasy is that this is when you kind of enter that gray area. There's a huge mix of players. There's guys who used to easily be in the top 3 rounds, but they're now kind of on the edge of a cliff. Everyone kind of thinks they're about to fall off and everyone's kind of scared to take them because they want them on their team, but they're not confident enough to take them in rounds 1 through 3. There's also a mix of guys who are young players who could break out. Players who typically have gone around 6, 7, 8, who had great seasons and could easily have another season that would propel them to be a top 10 or top 5 wide receiver, but they haven't done enough to really be in rounds 1 through 3. So these are also players who can be remembered for having a strong end of their season and then have completely blew it at different parts, and that's what you're not remembering. For example, David Montgomery had a super strong end of season last year, but didn't have the best beginning of the season to start with. So people might be remembering him for how strong he finished the year versus how his entire year looked in a whole perspective. So round 4 stud I want to talk about is Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper right now, he's the 39th overall off the board, going as the wide receiver 16. Last year, he finished as the wide receiver 28 between weeks 5 on with his quarterback at Carousel. When Andy Dalton took over from week 11 on, he was only the wide receiver 22. But when Dak Prescott was healthy, Amari Cooper was the wide receiver 3 through the first 4 weeks with only 1 touchdown. So if you include another 2 touchdowns in that performance, he easily could have jumped up to wide receiver 1 or 2. He was averaging 16.7 points per game. If you throw in those extra 2 touchdowns, he's averaging over 20 points per game, which is incredible. And Dak Prescott is healthy. The offense is loaded. The defense is still bad. They're still going to have to throw the ball a lot. Amari Cooper in round 4 as your wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 is going to be your huge advantage if that falls to you there. Another round 4 stud. Now, it's hard calling this guy a stud because the outlook on him has been so negative. This is why he's fallen to round 4. So I just want to basically set the tone for this. I'm calling him a stud, even though I may not want him on my team. Basically, a stud in the sense where if you're in round 4 and you need a running back 2 and he's on the board, you won't be disappointed. I'm going to talk about Josh Jacobs. He's going as the 41st overall as the running back 20. He finished as the running back 8 last year. So there's a lot of fear of Kenny Drake came in, the fear of them splitting carries evenly. Last year, Josh Jacobs had a sub 4 yards per carry average. He's a huge fantasy troll. There are games where he said he's going to play and then sat out. They also totally devastated their offensive line. So I don't think he's no longer a running back 1. Finishing as a top 10 running back this year might not be in the cards, but he could still finish as a top 15 running back. And if you're getting with a running back 20 when your team desperately might need a second RB2 on your roster, he's a good pick. So I think you need to see him as a decent RB2 if you've waited this long to take your running back 2. And if you don't take Jacobs, you're going to miss out because you could miss out on Gaskins or Mike Davis. And if you also miss out on those 2, you're going to be in deep trouble if you don't have any of those 3 as a running back 2. So this is not a Josh Jacobs is going to have a phenomenal year speech. He's a decent pick in round 4 if you haven't picked your second running back yet. Another round 4 guy, Kenny Golladay, 47th overall off the board as the wide receiver 21 right now. So this offseason, he got the most amount of money. He's by far the best wide receiver on their team. He's on the New York Giants. Now, the thing to note is he no longer has Matthew Stafford throwing him the ball. It's now Daniel Jones. The NFL has a really hot or cold rap for Daniel Jones. Either you're seeing him throwing beautiful deep balls or just fumbling and making terrible throws. So with the way they paid him, Kenny Golladay is going to get targeted as the wide receiver 1 on the Giants. He missed most of 2020 with injury, but if you remember back to 2019, he's the wide receiver 6. And he also, the last guy to grab who could break into the top 10 for wide receivers is basically why I've had him as a stud. He may not, when he was a top 10 wide receiver last time, it's purely based off the amount of touchdowns that he caught. But if you're late in the 4th round, you're in wide receiver 20s on the board, Kenny Golladay is one of the few, besides Adam Thielen, who has the ability to break into the top 10 for wide receivers, and that's what you're going for at this point if you're taking a wide receiver in round 4. You're looking for those guys who could do it because all the guys who may do it are already gone. So round 4 dud. Mentioned his name before, but David Montgomery. And I don't know how I feel yet about calling him a dud, but he's a guy that you shouldn't be taking in round 4 thinking he's going to do what he did last year. It's just not going to happen. Last year, he finished as the running back 4. He exploded after the bye week, but that is because of 2 things. Tariq Cohen was injured, so David Montgomery was the only back in the backfield because Cordell Patterson was backing him up. With the way the team was playing, they wanted to stay to the ground and pound and win through defense versus letting Mitch Trubisky throw the ball. So that just combining that with also playing the worst defenses throughout the second half of the season, worst defenses against the run, I should say, basically made David Montgomery godlike and basically helped people win fantasy championships last year. But if you think about the first half of the season, he was only the running back 15. And this was also with Tariq Cohen out of the backfield. So he only averaged about 11.5 points per game. He only broke 100 yards twice during that stretch. So basically what I'm saying is don't draft him thinking he could be a running back 1. You're drafting him as an RB2 with a low-end RB1 ceiling. Cohen will come back and eat into that workload too. So if you draft David Montgomery, he's basically at the end of the 4th round, you're taking him as your RB2, not as your RB1. I know he finished as an RB4 last year. I just can't say this enough. He has the ability to be an RB1, but with the way the team is going to play, with the players around him, he may not do what he did last year. Now, there is a very, very, very faint chance that if Justin Fields takes over, they become a more run-focused team. Defenses now have to consider Justin Fields on the running game. That could take less pressure off of David Montgomery, allowing him better runs, allowing him a better advantage carrying the ball, but he's not going to be a top 5 running back. He could break into the top 10. There's a very small chance of that, but you need to be realistic when you're looking at David Montgomery in round 4. Another round 4 done. Now, this is a wide receiver who last year had a lot of promise and a lot of opportunity. DJ Moore He's going as the 42nd overall wide receiver off the board as the wide receiver 18. He finished last year as the wide receiver 22, and that is on a team that didn't have Christian McCaffrey. So that meant this was DJ Moore's year to show that he could be the lead guy, and he just didn't come up with it. He only averaged 11.9 points per game, had over 1,000 yards, but just couldn't get touchdowns. Just ended the year with just not enough touchdowns to really propel him into fantasy relevance. And one of the reasons why DJ Moore just feels like a huge dud in round 4 is that his running mate basically had an identical season to him, and he's basically half the value in the draft. Talk about Robbie Anderson. Robbie is the reason why DJ feels so bad, because last year he finished as the wide receiver 24. That's only 2 spots behind DJ Moore. And you can draft him super late or even when undrafted in some leagues, averaging 11 points per game. He had 100 yards less and 1 touchdown less, but you can get him as the 81st overall off the board as the wide receiver 35. So if you're looking at DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson, would you rather have someone in the 4th round or have someone in the 8th round who are going to put up identical numbers? So that's why. I'd much rather Robbie Anderson in the 8th round than DJ Moore in the 4th round if they're going to have identical seasons in Carolina. Another round 4 dud at running back, DeAndre Swift. Now the running back himself, athletic, talented, it's just the fact of the team he's on and the outlook for their team just has so many red flags that you need to be careful of drafting him, because last year he finished as running back 18, averaging 12.8 points per game. The team he's on is the Detroit Lions, if you didn't know. This team doesn't have a good look for their season going into 2021. The team will be playing from behind a lot, which equates a lot of passing work. So in theory, if he's the main guy, he could be getting a lot of passing work trying to play from behind. But the team has signed Jamal Williams, who's a very talented back. He will eat into the workload. He's a pass-catching guy. And he's the guy who put Aaron Jones last year on the sideline in several crucial times in 2-minute drills. In important situations, Aaron Jones fantasy managers were like, why is Jamal Williams on the field? And the Detroit Lions went out and signed Jamal Williams. So that just kind of says they really want Jamal Williams to be included in the backfield. So DeAndre Swift might not have the year that you would hope if for some reason that Jamal Williams disappears and DeAndre Swift fully takes over. He'll be a great value in round 4. But taking him in round 4, thinking he could finish as a top 10 running back is just, it's not going to happen. He could be a top 15 running back, but you just need to be realistic taking running backs this late. This is why I like running back and going wide receivers in round 3 through 4, because you don't have these red flags attached to these running backs in these rounds that you have to worry about. So just to wrap this all up, here's a bonus tip. Write a pros and cons list for each player. You don't have to go super in depth, but just enough to help you make a decision on if you'd want them on your team or if you want them just to be completely avoided at all. This also helps with tilt. But going forward, follow us on all of our social media pages. If you have any interesting thoughts or want to debate me on something, I'd love to just talk fantasy football. So as I mentioned earlier, leave it in the comments section below. Just also keep track of the NFL news going forward and mock draft as much as you can. Mock drafting helps prevent the tilt. And that's all I can really say for now. And since I don't have Brian with me at the moment, I'm going to have to cheers you guys myself. So see you guys next time on the next episode. Look forward to hearing your thoughts.